Hey, what is up YouTube? Kolst here. We are back with a new video I wanted to make for a little while, but just haven't been able to. This will be the tier list video for all of the Duels Treasures that are currently in Arena and will be in Arena for probably, maybe not quite the next month. There'll be a little bit more time, but until the next expansion, which is announced, which I need to make a whole bunch more videos about too, but we'll get to that when we get to that. Right now, let's just jump right into this. I'm going to try to go pretty quickly through these because there is like 30 something of them. A few of them have been banned already from Arena. So I'm going to jump through those pretty quickly, but there's still like 30 something left. And again, as far as I know, I don't think Blizzard said anything, but I wouldn't expect these to stay once the new expansion happens. I kind of got the sense that they're a temporary thing. They haven't officially said that, but just once, you know, the next expansion hits, or potentially a pre-release expansion, which might happen for Arena. Sometimes a week before the expansion, Arena will get new cards. That's kind of when I would guess that these cards go away. I don't know that, but that's my prediction right now. So with that, unfortunately, I do have the upside that I have a lot of data to support where I'm putting these cards, because Firestone actually does have data for these things. But also I'm using, my own experience with these cards and stuff for where I place them. So that will go here. The first one we have is Gentleman's Top Hat. And Gentleman's Top Hat, this is probably already slightly controversial one, because I'm actually going to be putting this into A tier. Probably because it fits into my playstyle a lot, but this is just a very powerful card. It's 1 mana +2/+2 to a minion, and if you have another minion when it dies, the hat just jumps to another minion. Basically, if you're the aggressor and you're pushing, if they don't have the ability to full clear your board, they're going to lose, basically. So that's just a very powerful effect for this treasure, so that puts it very much into a high tier. Next up, we have Vampiric Fangs. This is 3 mana assassinate essentially, but also heals your hero for, I believe, what is it, the health of the hero? I can't read this thing. I think it's the health of the hero. Anyway, I'm also going to be putting this into A tier because, 3 mana assassinate's already good, but like, we are in a meta now in Arena where health like actually matters. We're gonna talk about this more for some other cards we're gonna be talking about later, but yeah, like health actually matters. So that additional health is a really good upside. I actually really like the 2 mana assassinate, which we'll talk about later as well, just for how cheap it is. But yeah, like paying a mana for that health oftentimes is very worth it. So it puts it into the A tier. Next up, we have, to be honest, what is this, Luming Presence or something? I actually don't know what this it's too small, I can't read it, but I'm not going to try to zoom or whatever. We're just going to put it here. This is going to go into B tier because this is 3 mana. It's an Arcane Intellect that also gives you 4 cards, or 4 armor, sorry. 2 draws and 4 armor. As I said, armor is good, and honestly, a lot of these dual treasures, I should say as well, like anything below B tier, you don't really want. Anything at B tier, you're like, okay, this is like fine. Anything at A tier, pretty happy to have. Anything at S tier, is going to be like the best card in your deck probably. Anything below C, you just really don't want. This card is just fine. It fits into a lot of decks. Armor is nice for really any deck. So it's on the lower end of B tier for sure, but I put it into B tier instead of C tier. Next up, we have Golden Kobold. This is a 3 mana 6/6 that replaces your hand with random legendaries. And this is a thing that probably is not very well known, but just obviously this is a very fun card. So a lot of people pick it a lot for, reasons, but objectively, replacing your hand with legendaries is bad. It's actually just straight up bad. It's a negative effect on average. Like, you can get lucky, but it's actually bad. So this is a 3 mana 6/6 with a very bad text on it. So overall, I'm actually going to be putting this into C tier. It is still like pickable, but objectively, like, there's just a lot of better treasures than it. You just don't really want it, but it's not terrible. Next up, we have Mutating Injection. This is 3 mana, give a minion +4/+4 and taunt. This card is fine. I'm going to be putting it into B tier because it's definitely just a solidly good card, right? It's like Blessing of Kings for 1 mana cheaper and plus taunt, which is almost always good, right? So it's a good card. So we'll just be putting it into B tier. Next up, we have Enrage. And actually, since we are at Enrage here, I want to jump to another one first because I want to actually talk about Pure Cold first. So I'm going to pull up Pure Cold. Pure Cold is 5 mana, deal 8 to the enemy hero, and also freeze it. This is one of the cards that was like shockingly good in my experience. I had a 12-win Warlock, which will hopefully eventually go onto YouTube. I'm very far backed up on that stuff, but it'll go up and eventually, hopefully soon. But yeah, this card's actually extremely good, better than you would have ever thought, because we're at a state in Arena where this kind of effect is actually really powerful. Not enough for me to put it quite into A tier, although honestly maybe I should, but I'm just going to be putting it into B tier, because it's still, I guess it's still conditional technically. It's not going to carry a bad deck exactly, unless it's an aggressive deck. But yeah, it's a very good piece of deck, so I'm going to be putting it into B tier. I still would probably pick a lot of, you know, more powerful board influencing effects above it, but yeah, it's a very strong card, so it's going to be putting up here. And the reason I want to talk about that first is because Enrage is essentially just a worse pure cold. It's one where this is just 3 mana, deal +6 attack to your hero, so you can use it as removal, but it's not very good for that really. You also kind of just want to use it as pure cold, but a lot of times it's just going to be worse than pure cold. It doesn't go through taunt mainly, that's the big downside. And also if you do use his removal, you can, but you have to take damage, so that kind of sucks. But in spite of that, this is a very underpicked card. I can see from Hearthstone data that almost no one picks it, but I'm actually going to be putting it into C tier as well, because it's still good just to be able to, you know, kill the enemy hero. So makes it actually an okay card, but still not one I exactly want. So that's where I put it into C tier. Next up, we have the Stone of, honestly, I don't know what the card is. I can't read that. I can't read this small. The Stone of something, but this is 3 mana. It gives your hero like +2 attack, and also like if you draw any spells, it's draw 2 cards. If you draw any spells, they get +1 spell damage. That's gonna go into B tier as well, just because it's a lot of stuff that, you know, that may or may not be good, but it's an upside. So I think it puts it above the cards that are in C tier. It's just fine. It's not a card you're exactly looking for, but it contributes positively to basically any deck. So that's going to put it into B tier. Next up, we have Puzzle Box. So Puzzle Box is a card where it's 3 mana. It transforms all minions on the board, including enemy minions, by the way, very important. I mean, most people probably figured that out the hard way if they didn't already know. But it transforms all minions into minions that I believe cost 3 or more. This card is going to go into C tier here. I thought this card would actually be better, but just the downside of the fact that it transforms the enemy board is very rough and very hard to avoid in my experience. If you can clear your entire opponent's board, it's really good, but that's just really hard to do nowadays. A lot of times you end up having to transform just one minion that you just don't have the ability to deal with. And then, you know, it can bite you basically. So it's very hard to use for that reason. It's still like fine and pickable. And in certain decks, if you really are good at controlling the board, it can be good. But on average, it's just not that great. So I'm going to be putting it into C tier here. Next up, we have, what is this card called? Sow the Seeds, I believe is its name. Look at my other monitor where it's slightly bigger. I'm going to be putting this into D tier. This is give all minions in your deck +1/+1. It's basically like, I don't know if you would say it's a good or a bad Embiggen. It's probably a worse Embiggen. I don't know actually. I'm not a big fan of Embiggen either. I'm putting it into D tier. It's just not really something you want. It's very delayed value. It's -1 card, which isn't a big deal nowadays. But it's just, I don't know. It's just really not that good. So I'm going to be putting it down there. Next up, we have Party Portal. Party Portal is a 1 mana 0/4 where every time you cast a spell, you get a random minion of its cost. There are some downsides of this. It can summon Doomsayer and stuff. I've seen that happen to people. It hasn't happened to me yet because I usually don't get offered this card. But in spite of all that, this card is going to be going solidly into A tier. It is just very strong. The amount of tempo you can get out of that is insane, and it's very likely if you can actually play this early or a while ahead, your opponent's going to have to use like spell removal to deal with it. A lot of times people have rushes, so it's not always going to work, but it can be very good sometimes. So yeah, it's basically like, you know, that mage weapon does pretty much the same thing, and that's one of the best arena cards like really ever, at least for non-legendaries. It's just a very good card, so that's going to put it into A tier. Next up, we have Hunter's Insight. This is a 1 mana spell, which reduces the cost of every other card in your hand by 1. There are some really dumb things you can do. I saw a post on Reddit where somebody played like double the Hunter card that fills your gives you a bunch of 4/1s, and they played like 6 4/1s on turn 2. There's some really strong things you can do. Just with anything that adds cards to your hand, there's a lot of potential for that. But even in the worst case, right? In the worst case, it's -1 card. If you draw it later on, it doesn't really matter. But there's just so many cases where if you play it early, it's going to be very good because it's effectively free anytime you want to play it. Because if you were going to play a 4-drop on 4, for example, you play this and you still play the 4-drop. It's net 0 that turn, and then the rest of your hand is still mana shielded. So almost always, this thing's going to be like +3 mana at least. And it can be more in certain decks, so like that's going to be enough, not enough for me to put it into like S tier or anything, but it's going to put it into A tier as well. Next up, we have Greedy Pickaxe. This is one I haven't actually gotten to play with yet, but this is a 4-mana 2/2 weapon that each time it swings, it casts Wild Growth. Basically, you gain an empty mana crystal. It's going to be enough to put it into C tier. It's a weird card because obviously it's really good sometimes if you have it on turn 4 exactly. If you don't draw it early enough, it's kind of bad. But even in the late game, it's still like 4 face damage, right? So it still does something that contributes positively. It can also kill like totems or something to let other stuff hit face, right? But yeah, it's just like okay. It's not a card I'm exactly looking for. It's better in certain decks, obviously, if you really think you can take advantage of the ramp. But in the average deck, it's just kind of not exactly what you're looking for. So overall, putting it into C tier. Next up, we have Creepy Curio. This is a 3-mana spell. It generates, I believe, 3 1/1 ghosts and then 3 2/2 ghosts. And then I believe the third form is just 3 3/3 ghosts. They might have lifesteal or something, actually. I'm not exactly sure. I don't really care because this card is going into the F tier. This is just a card that you shouldn't exactly take, because it's just not very good. The upside, there are some other shuffle cards that are much, much higher upside than this one. This one just isn't very good, so you just should not be taking it, because its first mode is bad. Like 3 1/1s for 3 mana is bad by modern standards, and even the second form isn't that good by the time you're likely to draw it, so it's just not very good. Next up, we have Crusty the Crustacean, I believe is its name. Crusty is like easily S tier. This card got banned for being overpowered, so I'm not going to talk about it too much, but it's just like, yeah, it's you can't draft it anymore. But yeah, it was, I think, the best secret by a good margin, so that's why it is there. Next up, we have Beastly Beauty. This is a 5-mana 2/6 rush. Whenever this attacks a minion and survives, it transforms into an 8/8. This card is actually one that I believe is actually probably lower than I would have expected, because I would have expected it to be on A tier, but objectively, its win rates are just, its data does not look very good. I'm going to be putting it still into B tier, but honestly, it's like I could almost justify C tier based off of it. The problem with it is that it's just it's very awkward. Like, you can imagine it kind of being like a Bane of Doom. Like, you want to be able to like kill something, but also it doesn't work on anything that has 6 or more attack because it'll die before it transforms. So it's just very awkward to use. You can't always use it on curve, and delayed it's a lot worse. And a lot of times the 8/8 just gets removed anyway, partially because of some of these other treasures that just kill any big minion, and shamans hexing it and stuff. So it's just not actually performing very well. It's still solid, but like I don't even know if I have picked it actually. It's just I haven't picked it myself because I've seen how awkward it is for other people. So it's still like okay, right? But it's not something you're excited about. One that's doing better than I expected though is Blood Moon. This is 3 mana, give all your minions +1/+1 in lifesteal. This is one I actually could probably justify giving the B tier, but I'm still going to lower it to the C tier just because it's a little bit conditional on what kind of decks actually want to draft it. But this one I'll actually say is a high C tier because, it's that healing really that is really good for certain decks. It's too expensive to really want to play this in any aggressive deck because it's just not worth playing 3 mana Power the Wild. But yeah, if you're a slower deck, this is the card that you play. You play a lot of taunts or rushes, and then you just stabilize based off this lifesteal. It could be very good for that reason, but it's just only good in certain decks. So for that reason, I'm putting it into the top of C tier, basically. Next up, we have Coin Pouch. This one is rather similar to Creepy Curio, but it's basically just a better version. It is possible to get kind of RNG wrecked by this, but it's just generally better. It's you get a 3-drop on the first version, then it shuffles into your deck. If you redraw it, you get a 6-drop on the second version, and then the third version is huge if you can actually get to it, because you get a 3, 6, and a 9-drop combined. So that upside is worth something. Still, however, I wouldn't recommend really drafting this. It probably gets a lot better if you're drafting, you know, something like a Control Priest or something where you're really actually trying to get to the late game. That probably makes it a lot better, but still, I'm just going to be putting it into D tier because most decks really, realistically, just don't want it. Next up, we have Merlock Holes. Merlock Holes is a 3-mana 3/4, which also, whenever your opponent draws a card, you get a copy of it, which is nice because it's basically a 3-mana 3/4 plus a card draw from. It's a copy from your opponent's deck. But as well, it is slightly awkward too, and I've actually had this happen against me. I've never had it happen where somebody like drew while I had this thing, but I've had it happen where my opponents had this and I've wanted to draw cards to find an answer for this thing, but you really can't because you're, you know, terrified of the effect of this. Still, overall, it's funny, like a lot of other things are just better than having this. You usually just don't get something that good, so I'm still going to be putting this only into B tier. It's probably on the edge of like B and A tier, but honestly, Merlock Holes just hasn't felt that strong when I've had it, so maybe I've been unlucky with the cards I've been copying, but that's just how it's felt to me, and the data sort of reflects it being around there, so I'm going to be putting it into the B tier. Next up, we have Old Militia Horn. This is 3 mana, give your minions +1/+1 in taunt, then you shuffle, and then the next form is +2/+2 in taunt, I believe, and then the third form, I believe, is +4/+4 with taunt and divine shield. So very strong if you can actually get that. However, it's kind of in the mode of Coin Pouch, where it's just, you know, it's a bit of a weaker card before you actually get there, so, you know, it's going to be into D tier. I think it's still better than Creepy Curio, for example, but just not exactly as useful or consistent as a lot of the other cards here. Next up, we have Spyglass. This is 1 mana, copy a random card in your opponent's hand, discount it by 3 mana. So it's like, most of the time, what you can do, one of the things you might want to be careful about is you might not want to play it like immediately on turn 1, especially if your opponent has the coin in their hand, because that would be really bad if you happen to hit that. But you can try to hold this. You can try to time it in such a way where your opponent seems to have played a lot of their curved stuff and you just happen to have a mana, and you can try to steal something big that they've been holding the entire game. You know, that's how you can use it. But overall, I mean, the stats show this card as being like very good. So I'm going to be putting it into the A tier here. I think most of the time. It's hard for it to be that bad, right? The worst thing is that you copy like, you know, a 1 or a 2 drop, and then, you know, I mean, it's still probably okay in that case, right? It's just not that bad. And there's the chance that you steal your opponent's treasure or legendary or whatever, so it could be very good. So overall, I think it makes it a very good card. Next up, we have Surly Mob. This is the best of the shuffle cards by far. This one, basically the first form is a Deadly Shot, destroy a random minion. The second form is destroy 2 random enemy minions. And the third form is really strong because it is silence and destroy all enemy minions. That just makes it very, very strong. Overall, I still just don't think it's like at the same level of a lot of like the A tier cards. Some of the stronger ones we haven't even gotten to yet, but like it will definitely put it into the B tier just because there is a lot of upside to. Even the second form specifically is really good, right? That's what really separates it from a lot of the other shuffle cards, is that you really like even just the second form. So that puts it up there. And obviously if you draw the third form, it's very insane too. Although it usually doesn't hit that much value by the time you actually would draw it, because the game's been stalling out at that point, but you know, it's still, you know, very high upside, so put it up here. Next up, we have the Exorciser. 3 mana, 3/3 weapon, silence all any minion attacked by this weapon. I may be biased because I had a like quad buzzard deck that got completely erased by this card, but I'm gonna be putting this into A tier. It's just it's performing very well in the stats. Like, it's just a very solid card, right? A 3 mana 3/3 weapon's already really good, and if you get any value out of the silence, it's just good. So gonna be putting it up into the A tier. There are certain things, again, like buzzard and just other things that it really does negate pretty well, so it can be very strong there. One of those things, by the way, is the next card we have here, which is Holy Book. 8 mana, silence and destroy a random enemy minion. Summon a 10/10 copy of it. This is going to definitely be going into the S tier. I think it was worse than Crusty, but it's obviously very, very strong. There's obviously the potential that your opponent might play like a Proto Drake or just some big death rattle and you get to steal it. But honestly, the silence effect for me in my experience just hasn't been that relevant. What's been really relevant for me is that, you know, a lot of the times by the time you actually play this, they've already used their hex or hard removals, whatever. And then you just use this and you get a 10/10. And a lot of games, the 10/10 just can't be dealt with. That's really the strong part of it. So that's really what's been very strong about it, is just a very high chance that you just happen to choose anyone that doesn't actually have a hard removal with this. It's kind of similar with Crusty, honestly. But Crusty was just better mainly for the same exact reason, because it was cheaper though. But yeah. Holy Book definitely very, very strong as well. Next up we have Mind Apocalypse. This is an interesting card because it's like 0 mana. Both players draw 2 cards and gain an empty mana crystal. Actually, it says gain a mana crystal, so I believe you get to use it initially. I've never played this card myself, but this is a card where it's like theoretically it can be very good in certain ramp style decks. Any deck that would actually like ramp. And because you pick these Duels Treasures on pick 30, you actually would know whether or not you have a good deck for those. So that actually has made it very well. If I was going purely by win rates, this would actually go into the B tier, but it's not a very commonly picked card, and I think it's because it doesn't fit into a lot of decks. So because of that, I'm going to be demoting it to the C tier. It's still higher than I honestly thought it would be, but yeah, it's just if you have the right deck for it, you take it, but it's not an ideal pick for a lot of decks. I'm going to be putting it down there. Next up, a Butch. This is like a 5 mana 2/2 rush. It's only playable if you have a lot of beasts. Most classes don't have a lot of beasts. We're just gonna put it in F tier. It's also banned from drafts, so you can't see it anymore. So won't talk about it anymore. Next up, you have the Princess. This is a 7 mana 7/6 minion with Battle Cry. Copy the death rattle of 3 random death rattles in your deck. It's very strong in theory, right? If you have the support for it, and you can actually live long enough and not have it and actually have it die, etc., etc. But that's a lot of ifs, and also the main problem is that you just don't have enough death rattles to support it, or even the right death rattles to support it. And even if you do, if you have a Proto Drake or whatever in your deck, first of all, that makes your deck greedy because you have multiple big slow cards. But second of all, you might draw the Proto Drake and then this thing's dead, right? So there's still some potential, so I'm not going to put it into F tier. I'm going to be putting it into D tier. If you have the right deck for it, by all means, go for it. But it's just most decks are not good for it, so put it into the D tier. Being a good cards, though, the next one we have is Bubba. This is a 6 mana 6/6 with Battle Cry. Summon 6/1/1. I forget what they call them. That word is longer than wolf, but like they're little dogs that have probably hounds with. It doesn't tell you they do, but they actually have rush, and also they attack a minion that you target. So if your opponent doesn't have any minions to target, you just get a board full of 1/1s, fills up your board. But also, if you kill one minion with the dogs, you can actually, the rest of the dogs that weren't used are actually still able to attack because they have a rush. The card does not say that. Some of these duelist cards have funny text, they're not very clear. But that's an important thing to know, because that is a big deal, because that just makes this card so flexible, and that's why I'm going to be putting it. I don't think it's quite worthy of being an S tier, but it's a very high A tier. Just a very good flexible card if you just want to, you know, play for good tempo and just stay on board. Like, that thing is just very, very useful for that. Next up, we have Clockwork Assistant. This is a 3 mana 1/1 with Battle Cry. Has +1/+1 for each spell you've cast this game. Back in older meta, this card would be like absolutely unplayable, but nowadays you have a lot of spells, so this card is okay, I think. I'm gonna be putting it into C tier. I think I had it like once maybe and it was fine. It's still not great because, you know, realistically you're just not very likely to play a lot of spells early. Like, you can't play this on curve, for example, right? Oh, actually, I don't think it's a Battle Cry. I said it was a Battle Cry, but it has +1/+1 for each spell you've cast. So if it's on the board and you play spells, it actually does get buffed. It's not a Battle Cry, by the way. But And that helps its power level, but it's still a little bit awkward because it's just a lot of stats. It's kind of the beastly beauty problem too that I mentioned, that a lot of times the 8/8 just gets killed. Same thing, this thing just gets killed a lot of the time. But sometimes it doesn't, right? And if you have it later on, it's useful, right? So it's just a dead card earlier, but overall it puts it into C tier. Next up, we have Loyal Henchmen. This is a card that I think a lot of people slept on just how strong it is, because this is actually going to be the last card we put into the S tier. This is a 2-mana 1/1 with start of game, add to your hand, and then each turn this is your hand, gain +1/+1. So the way it works essentially, first of all, you want to always mulligan it away because you will draw it. So if you do not mulligan it away, you are -1 card from where you would have been. So that's the important thing to know. But so it's +1 card automatically, but also the way it works is essentially that it's going to always be, if it's turn 2, it's going to be a 2/2. If it's turn 5, it's going to be a 5/5. You know, whatever the turn is, that's what its stats are going to be. So it's just very, very strong. You just want to be careful not to greed it too long. Sometimes you do, but like more often than not, you want to actually just play it in the mid game sometime as like a 5/5 or a 6/6 or something. Whenever you just happen to have the right amount of mana and your play makes sense to just slot it in. That's usually the strongest way to use it. But yeah, as it is, it's like, because it's like effectively draw a card and also, you know, like a 2-mana 6/6 or something. It's just very, very strong. So that puts it up into the S tier. Next up, we have Necrotic Poison. This is a 2-mana assassinate. Effectively, it's just destroy a minion. This is just a very good effect, though. I think it's probably on the lower end of A tier, but I am going to be putting it into A tier. I've had a lot of games where just being able to do that for that cheap is just really good, right? You can imagine it's like Sap, basically. It doesn't silence stuff like Sap does, but it's basically as good tempo-wise as Sap most of the time, right? So it's just very, very strong. So I'm going to be putting it into A tier. But this was Amalgamate. When I said it was Mindpocalypse earlier, that was Mindpocalypse. This one is Amalgamate. So Amalgamate is another card that is not draftable. This is like probably the worst treasure period though. So this one is it's like destroy all your minions and then create a minion that combines all their stats into one amalgam. This is just really bad because like there are certain times where it could work in theory, but this is the exact opposite of what you want to do a lot of the time, because there's some of the treasures and just other things, there's just ways to deal with a minion. So it's like usually just not good. There'd be certain things you could do if you could like kill your own death rebels especially, but you know, more often than not, this is just not good. You wouldn't want it anyway. It's not draftable, so we'll move on. Next up, Supercharge. This might be the most underrated treasure in my opinion, because this is a 0 mana, give your minions +2 health. It's not the flashiest thing, but this is just has a lot of potential, because if you just throw a couple minions on board early, you can just play this on like turn 3, turn 4, and then suddenly all those AoEs, lightning storm type stuff, whatever, that would have cleared you just don't work anymore, right? Because it just doesn't kill stuff. It's very, very powerful, so I'm going to be putting into B tier. The other thing is that also, even in a slower deck, you can wait until you can greed it. And, you know, once you're on 9 or 10 mana or something, once your board really starts filling up, once your win conditions start coming online, that's when you would play it too. It's just very good, so contributes very positively to basically any deck, so gonna be putting it up there. Next up, we have Astral Portal, which is probably, I'm not sure if there are any others, but this is probably like the most overrated card objectively. This card is actually going to be, this will probably shock some people, this is going down into D tier. This card is just not good. Like, it's not a risk you really want to take. The average legendary minion just isn't that good. There's a good chance you get slightly more stats than you're supposed to, but you know, a lot of legendaries also are based off of battle cries, so you're not getting the battle cries. That makes it very bad. And also there's ways to steal cards, and then your opponent might just steal the legendary if you do get a good battle card. There's a lot of bad things to it. Overall, it might be slightly better if you're, you know, if you're a weaker player, to put it bluntly. Like, it might be objectively a bit better than this, but at least for me, it's like, this is not a card I want to have in my deck. It's just not enough upside to justify the level of risk it is, so I'll be putting it into D tier. Next up, we have Mage Armor. This is another card, I believe the last card, well, there's only 2, and I know this one's draftable, so this is the last card that was actually banned. This card is actually surprisingly was performing surprisingly well, just because, again, kind of the same reason that Pure Cold and even Enrage are decent cards. This card's actually a decent card for the exact opposite reason, to heal out of range of stuff instead of doing it. It's a lot better than it would have been. I'm actually going to be putting it into the C tier because it's actually just good to have armor. Obviously, certain decks you're going to prioritize it way higher than others. If you're trying to be a tempo aggressor, you wouldn't want this card, but if you're trying to just be more of the survivor type of deck, then it's would have definitely been a reasonable card, but you can't draft it anymore, so much for that. And the last card we have is Worshipper, I believe. Can't really see it anyway because it's really small, but this is a 3 mana. This one shows the 1/4 version, I believe, but this is actually a 2/4 that has gives your hero +3 attack. This is just an extremely good tempo card because that's a lot of damage that can go face. A lot of times it doesn't die also, and then you get to attack multiple times and you can get, you know, just a lot of damage out of that thing. So this is going to be going into the A tier as well. So with that, that is it for this review, I guess. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Are there any other thoughts I have about... There were some other thoughts I wanted to mention about Duels Treasures in general. But yeah, I mean, one of the big takeaways is that there is a lot of just neutral removal available, and that's influenced the meta in a certain ways. You just don't expect big things to really stick, essentially. But otherwise, they haven't had the biggest impact on Arena, in my opinion. Some people were, frankly, freaking out about them, thinking they were going to destroy Arena. It's very rare, though, that you really get cheesed. Like, that one time I got Exerciser just to ruin my buzzards. Like, that was the one time I really got ruined by a Duels Treasure, and just certain times like Holy Book's really good too, but otherwise they honestly just haven't been that impactful. Most of these cards that are, you know, especially B tier and below, but even the A tier cards are not, you know, that big of a standout most of the time over just strong cards in any other class. Most of them are not a big deal, frankly. But with that, again, let me know what you think in the comment section below. Appreciate you guys all hanging out. We'll see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.